All right, how you all doing today? This is going to be part two of our lecture series on uh, libertarian anarchism, and it's our second week. Now, uh, this is that last reading I gave you guys this week, and where it kind of talked about the link between spirituality and anarchist thought. I thought we should dive into that a little bit today, right? So, that last reading kind of argued that, the idea when most people think of anarchists, they think of somebody who's opposed to all centralized authority structures. So, most anarchists are, obviously against the state. They're against the capitalist system, which they see as intertwined together. And they're usually against organized religion, because the church has always had deep ties to the capitalist system on the one hand, and especially the state. Think about it. Back in the day, the top religious leaders became the state leaders, and the state leaders become a reflection of the religious interests at the time. While such states are more rare today, they still exist, right? Think Saudi Arabia, Iran, which are basically theocracies, right? Now, that last article I gave you guys suggested, though, that not all anarchists are skeptical of religion and the church. Many actually have a spiritual component. While they don't like the church and they don't like organized religion per se, they believe that anarchism is the only political philosophy that is actually conducive to a true spiritual society. I'll say that one more time. And the belief that an anarchist society is the only thing that's most conducive, is this type of system most conducive for a truly spiritual society, right? So basically, the idea is that an anarchist society emphasizes self-sufficiency. It emphasizes mutual aid, people coming together, working in communities to solve their common problems without excessive hierarchy at the top, right? It emphasizes more friendly systems of trade, even gift economies within small-scale communities. That's just where somebody gives something and not expecting anything in return, right? So many anarchist thinkers have actually said that if you remove the state, that's going to bring out the best in people, right? Or put it another way, right? If you cultivate true spiritual people, true spiritual values in your community, there's going to be no need at all for the state. And in fact, all the state can do is corrupt a more spiritual inclined people, right? Now, so what do we find examples where there's been a link between spirituality on the one hand and between anarchism? Well, Leo Tolstoy was a major kind of like Christian philosopher, and he advocated we cannot have a state. The state just perverts and corrupts everything in its path. Henry David Thoreau was a very spiritual thinker, right? His spirituality was found in nature and connected to the earth. And he advocated that the state was a great menace in society. And in many of his writings, he suggests that the more centralized your structures are, capitalism and the state, the more we pervert our natural relationship of spirit with the earth, right? And there's been numerous thinkers along this line. Many of the 1960s hippies, of course, were some of our best known examples of those advocating that in order to have a true spiritual society, i.e. values of peace, love, oneness, unity, mutual respect, self-sufficiency, reverence for the earth, all of these wonderful things, acknowledgement that we're all interconnected. In order to have those kinds of values lived out collectively, You can't have a state because the state is kind of the opposite, according to most anarchists, of those kind of values. So many of the hippies you find were intensely spiritual. You think Gary Schneider, I'm thinking Ram Dass, Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, Alan Watts, and they all, by the way, had very kind of like anarchist beliefs on the role of the state. They said that, anarchism was really the only system that would promote a spiritual society. And likewise, a true spiritual community would be a reflection of more anarchist principles, right? So many of the 60s hippies actually were what we might call spiritual anarchists. They weren't like the mainstream anarchists where they said, don't believe in God, don't believe in religion. They just believed in a more kind of personalized spirituality and said that the state will naturally corrupt that, right? So, I hope you guys found that article kind of interesting. That, I would make the case that, a truly spiritual people, which should ideally be the backbone of every society, but the key is it begins individually within each of us and then expands out. Ideally, you wouldn't even need to have a powerful state for that. And again, examples from history, the Native American societies, right? Almost all Native American communities here in our own country, right, were, prior to the European invasion in 1492, prior to that period, the Native Americans lived without a state, without a formal capitalist system, without a church hierarchy. And they how did they do that? They cultivated good morals, values, and they made their spiritual principles the backbone of their entire society, right? And from that, there was no need for a centralized state. So many of the Native American communities would be the original spiritual anarchists, at least in this country, right? And then of course, like I said, examples abound from the 60s. And of course, all of the attempts for many of the hippies to form their own intentional communes. That's where they moved off the land, bought huge acres of land, set up water catchment systems, grew their own food, registered many of their communities as churches, right, in order to avoid taxation from the government. They were far enough along into their own land and living in remote areas where many times the government couldn't even really track them. The state couldn't track them, right? And there's many of these types of communities that also exist in Southeast Asia, high in the Himalayan mountains. There's examples of entire communities that have long existed without a state, rooted in spiritual principles. There's this one area, huge stretch in the Himalayas. I think it's called Nambia, and basically it's just a vast area of land that has no state rule over it. It's these fiercely independent people who have been able to kind of skirt the state while adhering to their spiritual principles, right? Some argue the Amish are a contemporary example, though of course they're still kind of within the bounds of the state, but they've kind of cultivated their own autonomy. The Amish might be an example of a spiritual stateless society. So I hope you found this kind of interesting. I hope this helps. I actually do plan on sometime writing a piece on spiritual anarchism, the link between spirituality and anarchism. And again, I would argue that an anarchist society would be the collective expression of a spiritual people, and then, and vice versa. So why don't you guys, I hope you guys are doing well and staying peaceful, and so much peace to everybody. Take care.